There was a silence in that country that was more than just a lack of sound. It was a presence, heavy and absolute, pressing down from a sky the color of hot brass. The heat was a living thing, too, a shimmering veil that warped the air and made the distant purple mountains tremble like a mirage. They offered no comfort. Those mountains, they were just a harder, sharper version of the same unforgiving land. Here, in the Arizona territory, the earth did not care for the troubles of men. It was a place of terrible beauty, where the skeletal arms of the saguaro cactus reached for the merciless sun, and life was a gamble wagered on a hidden spring, a sliver of shade, the mercy of a coiled rattlesnake. It was a land that would kill you as soon as look at you, and it never looked away. Half buried in the fine red dust, a figure lay still. She was 20 years old, though the sun and the sorrow had carved lines on her face that belonged to a woman twice her age. Her dress, a thing of faded calico meant for church socials in Ohio, was a tattered ruin, stiff with dirt and sweat. The skin on her arms was cracked and blistered, and her lips were swollen parts of a face that had forgotten the feel of water. Her name was Alara Vance, but she had lost her name along with everything else. Behind her scorched eyelids, the world was a storm of broken pictures, her father's voice, broad and certain, booming about the paradise waiting for them in the west. A new start, Ilara, land of our own. Her mother's smile, growing thinner each day of the journey, until it was just a pale, tired line. The sickening crack of the wagon axle, a sound as final as a gunshot. And then the sickness came, swift and cruel. It took her mother first, then her father, their bodies racked with a fever that burned them up from the inside. The last memory, the one that clawed at her even in this stupor, was of Thomas, her little brother, his face small and gray. She had dug his grave with her own hands, scraping at the hard-baked earth until her fingers were raw and bleeding, piling stones over the shallow scrape to keep the coyotes away. Now, survival was just a muscle twitching. It had no hope in it, no purpose. It was an instinct she almost hated, this thing that made her body push on when her soul had already surrendered. She crawled, one hand forward, then a knee. The dust was hot as coals. She did not know where she was going. She was just moving away from the place where she had left the last piece of her heart in the ground. Miles away, a man moved through the same landscape, but he was not its victim. He was a part of it. Kale slipped between the cholla and the prickly pear with a grace that left little trace, his moccasins whispering over the stony ground. The sun that had broken Ilara had only burnished his skin to the color of dark copper. He was lean, all corded muscle and sinew built for endurance, not for show. Faint, silvery scars crisscrossed his arms and chest, a map of hunts and battles that he no longer thought about. He was tracking a small herd of pronghorn, his focus a sharp, narrow point. His eyes were the kind of dark that seemed to hold the night sky in them, intelligent and watchful, but shadowed by a sadness so deep it felt ancient. It was a sorrow he kept locked away, a private country inside himself. 2 winters had passed since the dawn raid. He could still smell the gunpowder and the burning hides, still hear the screams that were cut short by the bugle's call. The soldiers had come while the camp slept, a whirlwind of blue coats and flashing sabers. They had called his people hostiles, but there had been no war party, only families waking to a new day. He had been away, checking his trap lines. When he returned, he found his world erased. His wife, Naylan, lay near the ashes of their wickiup, her dark hair spread across the frozen ground. His son, Taza, small and still, was a few feet away. That day had shattered more than his heart. It had shattered his faith in the world, in the possibility of peace, in the wisdom of the elders who spoke of treaties one day and vengeance the next. He had pulled away since then, becoming a man of long silences. He found more truth in the cry of a hawk than in the talk around the council fire. Some of the other warriors saw his quiet grief as a weakness. They called him soft because his rage was a cold, hard stone in his gut instead of a fiery war cry on his lips. He was caught between the old ways that demanded blood for blood and the new world of the white man that saw him as nothing more than a pest to be cleared from the land. He felt like a ghost, haunting the edges of a life that was no longer his. He saw the disturbance in the dust first. The sharp, cloven tracks of the pronghorn were there, but laid over them was something else, a strange, stumbling drag mark, the mark of a two-legged creature, clumsy and dying. He followed it, his hunter's curiosity mingled with a tired sort of dread. Another prospector, probably. Another fool who thought he could conquer the desert with a pickaxe and a canteen. He expected to find a corpse bloating in the sun. Instead, he found her. She was unconscious at the foot of a granite outcropping, a heap of torn cloth and sun-bleached hair. He stopped, his face a mask of stone. A white woman. His first feeling was a cold, bitter wave of resentment. She was one of them, the invaders, the people who had taken everything that mattered. His hand rested on the hilt of his knife, a reflexive gesture. The law of the desert was simple. Let it claim what it had already won. To interfere was to invite trouble. His first instinct was to turn and walk away, to leave her to the buzzards and the heat. It was the fate the land itself had chosen for her. He circled her slowly, like a wolf assessing its prey. Her hair, the color of dried corn silk, was fine-spun and tangled with burrs. The fabric of her dress, though ruined, was soft and unfamiliar. Her throat was exposed, the skin thin and vulnerable over the faint pulse he could just barely see. And as he looked, the hard shell around his heart began to crack. She was not a soldier. She was not a threat. She was as helpless as a newborn fawn left behind by its mother. He knelt. He reached out a hand, his fingers hesitating for a moment before touching the hot, dry skin of her forehead. The contact sent a jolt through him, a flicker of something he had not felt in 2 years. Pity, memory, a shared and terrible humanity. He remembered kneeling just like this in the snow, touching Nalen's cold cheek for the last time. He saw the ghost of his wife's suffering in the cracked lips and hollowed eyes of this stranger. The warrior in him argued for pragmatism, for survival, for the cold logic of hatred. But the man who had loved Nalin and Taza, the man whose own soul was a landscape of grief, could not turn his back. With a long, slow sigh that seemed to carry the weight of all his losses, Cale made his choice. He slid his arms beneath her, one under her knees, the other behind her back. She was shockingly light, a bundle of brittle bones and dry skin. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and her dry, brittle hair brushed against his arm. He felt the whisper of her breath against his neck, a faint, desperate puff of air. It was the only sign she was still among the living. He carried her away from the sun-scorched flats, moving into the shadowed canyons he knew as well as the lines on his own hand. His camp was not much, a place no one else would ever find. It was a shallow alcove carved by wind and water into a sandstone cliff, hidden behind a thicket of mesquite. A seep spring, little more than a damp patch of rock, provided a slow, steady drip of precious water. The place was a reflection of his life, sparse, solitary, and sufficient. A sleeping pallet of woven grasses covered with a deerskin, a few clay pots for cooking and water, his bow and a quiver of arrows, his knife, that was all. He laid her down gently in the shade of the overhang, on his own sleeping pallet. Then he began the slow, patient work of calling her back from the edge. He soaked a strip of clean buckskin in a gourd of water and squeezed it over her lips, letting the drops fall one by one. He watched as her throat moved, a tiny, convulsive swallow. It was a start. He took a piece of dried venison from his pouch and chewed it, breaking it down with roots he knew would give strength until it was a soft paste. He carefully worked a small amount into her mouth, his movements precise and efficient. It was an intimate act, yet he performed it with an impersonal focus. He was not saving a white woman. He was simply tending to a life that was flickering out. And the act felt less like charity and more like a quiet prayer for the 2 lives he had failed to save. For the next few days, Ilara lived in a fog. Her world was a fever dream, a collage of heat and shadow, pain and a strange, gentle coolness. She would open her eyes and see a face above her, all sharp angles and dark, concerned eyes. She would feel the unbelievable gift of water on her parched tongue, the unexpected softness of a hide beneath her aching back. But her mind was a swamp of fear. The stories she had heard all her life, whispered around campfires and preached from pulpits, came rushing back. Stories of savages, of brutal warriors who killed without mercy. Her delirious mind took the dark face above her and twisted it into the boogeyman from her nightmares. In her moments of brief, terrifying clarity, she was paralyzed. A scream would build in her chest, but her throat was too raw to make a sound. She would try to move, to fight or flee, but her limbs felt like they were filled with lead. All she could do was lie there, her heart hammering against her ribs, and stare into the face of her captor. Cale saw the terror in her eyes. He watched her struggle with a quiet, stoic patience. He did not speak to her. His Chiricahua words would only be another source of fear. Instead, he spoke with his actions. When he had to be near her, he moved slowly, never making a sudden gesture. He would leave a small bowl of water and a little food near her pallet, then retreat to the far side of the small camp, sitting with his back to her to give her space. He understood her fear. It was not about him, not truly. It was the fear of her people, a fear they had sharpened into a weapon and used against his for generations. He would not answer it with anger. He would answer it with stillness. A week passed. The blisters on her skin began to heal, and the swelling in her lips went down. The fever broke. One afternoon, she found the strength to push herself up, to sit with her back against the cool rock of the alcove. Her head spun, but the world stayed in one place. She saw him across the camp, sitting cross-legged in a patch of sunlight. He was fletching an arrow, his long, capable fingers working with a practiced, hypnotic skill. He would shave a feather with a sliver of obsidian, bind it to the shaft with sinew, and turn it. His eyes narrowed in concentration. He was a figure of immense power, of a grace that seemed to come from the earth itself. The sight was both terrifying and mesmerizing. He finished his work and rose. He moved to the small fire pit, where a rabbit stewed in a clay pot. The smell of it made Alara's stomach clench with a hunger so fierce it was painful. He ladled some of the thin broth into a small bowl and walked toward her. Every muscle in her body went tense. This was it. The stories were true. He had fattened her up, and now he would... Her mind could not finish the thought. He stopped a few feet away and knelt, holding the bowl out to her. Her eyes were wide, fixed on his face. She could not read his expression. It was calm, unreadable. She tried to raise her hand to take the bowl, but it began to tremble. A violent, uncontrollable shaking. The fear was a living thing inside her, a cold knot in her gut that would not dissolve. She could not do it. She could not take food from his hand. Cale saw her distress, the tremor that racked her thin frame. He did not insist. He did not push the bowl closer or make a sound of impatience. He simply withdrew his offering and placed the bowl on the dusty ground between them. Then he sat back on his heels and waited. He did not look at her. Instead, he turned his gaze to the west, where the sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the clouds in fiery strokes of orange, pink, and deep purple. The silence stretched on, broken only by the first chirps of the evening crickets. The sun sank lower, and the shadows grew long. Alara sat frozen, her gaze flickering between the man's stoic profile and the steaming bowl of broth. The rich, savory scent was a form of torture. Her hunger warred with her fear, a desperate battle waged in the landscape of her exhausted soul. He just sat there, patient as the stone at her back, watching the day die. And in his patience, something shifted inside her. The fear did not vanish, but another feeling began to dawn alongside it, a sense of wonder at his stillness. He was not threatening her. He was not forcing her. He was simply waiting. Finally, Hunger won. Slowly, tentatively, her hand shaking a little less now. She reached for the bowl. Her fingers brushed against the warm clay. She pulled it toward her, her eyes never leaving his face. For a fleeting second, his gaze shifted from the horizon to meet hers. In that instant, everything she had ever been told, everything she had ever feared, fell away. She did not see a savage in his eyes. She did not see cruelty or malice. She saw a profound and weary loneliness, a quiet sadness that felt as vast and as deep as the desert sky. And in that sadness, she saw a shocking reflection of her own. It was a silent acknowledgement that passed between them, a recognition of their shared status as the last one standing after the storm had taken everyone else. She lifted the bowl to her lips and drank. The broth was hot and rich, tasting of wild herbs and meat. It was the most nourishing, most wonderful thing she had ever tasted in her life. It tasted like survival. The days bled one into the next, measured not by the hands of a clock, but by the slow crawl of shadows across the canyon floor. A fragile, unspoken routine began to weave itself around Alara and Kale, a quiet rhythm of survival that became its own kind of language. Alara's body mended. The sun-cracked skin on her arms healed into a light brown, and the hollows in her cheeks filled out. Her physical strength returned, but her spirit remained a fractured thing. A glass jar dropped on a stone floor, the pieces still sharp and scattered. The vast, silent land that had nearly been her tomb was now the whole of her world. Her days were spent watching him. She learned the shape of his life through silent observation. He greeted the dawn each morning, standing at the edge of the cliff, facing the rising sun with a stillness that was a prayer in itself. When he hunted, his focus was so absolute it was as if the world contained nothing but him and his prey. She saw him speak to his horse, a sturdy pinto that grazed at the far end of the canyon, his voice a low, gentle murmur that was different from any sound she had ever heard him make. Slowly, the terrifying image of the Apache warrior from her nightmares dissolved, replaced by the reality of the man, a person of deep discipline, quiet habits, and a gentleness that was as surprising as finding a wildflower blooming from a rock. He, in turn, watched her. He saw the way a sudden noise, the cry of a hawk or the clatter of a falling stone, would make her flinch and draw into herself. He saw the haunted, faraway look that clouded her blue eyes when she stared into the fire, her mind clearly revisiting a place of terrible pain. At night, he would lie on his own pallet a few feet from hers and hear the small, choked sounds she made in her sleep. Her body racked with convulsive shudders as the nightmares took hold. He knew that landscape of grief intimately. He had been wandering in it for 2 long years. He recognized the terrain of loss, the treacherous drop-offs of memory, the barren plains of loneliness. He began to leave small tasks for her, things that required focus, a pile of pungent herbs to be sorted for poultices, a water skin with a leaky seam that needed mending with an awl and sinew. He would place them near her sleeping pallet without a word and walk away. It was not a command, but an offering. He knew that idle hands allowed the mind to wander into dark places. He was giving her a reason to stay in the present moment, a small purpose to anchor her to the world of the living. And she, understanding the unspoken gesture, would pick up the herbs, her fingers slowly sorting leaf from stem, her mind quieting with the simple, repetitive motion. Communication was a slow, painstaking thing, a bridge built one small stone at a time across the vast chasm that separated their worlds. It was a language of gestures, of pointing, of sounds that slowly acquired meaning. He would touch the gourd of water and say, "Tu." She would repeat the sound, her tongue clumsy around the unfamiliar word. "Tu." He would point to the crackling fire. "Ko." Then to the piece of roasted rabbit. "Itzi." She would point to the great, empty expanse above them. "Sky," she would say, her own voice sounding strange and foreign in the immense silence. He would look up and repeat her word, a small smile touching the corner of his mouth. "Sky." Then he would give her his own. "Ya." It became a quiet game they played in the evenings, sitting on opposite sides of the fire. The exchange of these simple words was more than just a lesson. It was the weaving of a thread between them. Through these small exchanges, Elara began to see that his world, which she had been taught was one of godless savagery, was in fact as rich and detailed as the one she had lost. He showed her things she had never imagined. He taught her how to find water not by looking for a river, but by watching the flight of finches. He showed her how to strip the fibrous root of a yucca plant and mash it into a soothing poultice for her still healing skin. He would kneel in the dust and show her the stories left in the tracks of animals, the hurried scramble of a quail, the heavy tread of a wandering bear, the delicate prints of a doe and her fawn. He was teaching her to read the land, to see it not as an enemy, but as a book filled with knowledge. She, in her own way, began to share the fragments of her own broken world. She could not tell him about the green hills of Ohio or the smell of her mother's baking, but she could hum a tune her mother used to sing while mending clothes, a simple, sad little melody that needed no translation. One afternoon, she picked up a stick and, in the smooth dust near the fire, she traced the shape of their farm, a small square for the house, a larger rectangle for the barn, the wavy line of the creek where she and Thomas used to catch frogs. Cale watched her, his dark eyes following the lines in the dirt, and though he could not know what they meant, he understood that she was showing him a piece of her soul. These moments were filled with a poignant intimacy, a communion that ran deeper than words. The season began to turn. The relentless heat of summer softened, and a crispness crept into the night air. The sun slanted lower in the sky, turning the canyon walls to gold each afternoon. It was then that Cale decided she needed to learn a more fundamental lesson of survival. One day, he returned from a hunt with 2 rabbits, their long ears limp. He dispatched the first one quickly, a clean and necessary act that still made Elara's stomach turn. He skinned it with swift, practiced motions. Then he turned to her and held out the second rabbit, along with his knife. The knife was a formidable thing, a piece of dark flint chipped to a razor-sharp edge and bound to a handle of smoothed wood. Its cold, hard weight felt alien in her hand, a tool of brutal purpose. He knelt beside her, his presence suddenly overwhelming in its proximity. He took her hand, the one holding the knife, and covered it with his own. His skin was warm and calloused against hers. He guided her fingers, positioning the point of the blade against the rabbit's soft belly, showing her where to make the first cut. His movements were efficient, sure, born of a lifetime of this work, but to Elara, it all felt too fast, too violent. The warmth of his hand, the strange intimacy of his touch combined with the visceral, bloody task before her, sent a tremor of panic through her. Her breath hitched. The world seemed to shrink to the point of the knife, the dead animal, and the feeling of his strength enveloping her. "Be gentle. It's too fast," she whispered, the words ragged and choked. Her plea was not just about the rabbit. It was about everything. It was about the terrible speed with which her life had been torn apart, the bewildering pace of this new reality she had been thrown into, a world where survival meant doing this. Cale froze. Every line of his body went rigid. He heard the desperation in her voice, saw the raw terror in her wide, blue eyes. For a split second, he misunderstood. He thought her words were a cry of revulsion, a recoiling from him, the savage, forcing this bloody task upon her. A flicker of his old, deep bitterness flared in his chest. He pulled his hands back from hers as if her skin had burned him, his expression hardening into a cold mask. But then he looked closer. He saw that the fear in her eyes was not directed at him. It was turned inward. It was the fear of the violence of the act. Yes, but it was also the fear of her own weakness, her own inability to do what was necessary. He saw not disgust, but a profound and heartbreaking fragility. And in that moment, he understood. A wave of comprehension washed the hardness from his face. He took a slow, deep breath, the anger dissolving into something else entirely. Without a word, he reached out and took her hand again. This time, his touch was different. It was not the efficient grip of a teacher. It was infinitely patient, achingly tender. He did not force her fingers to move. He simply held them, his own hand a warm, steady presence around hers. He began to speak, his voice a low, soothing murmur in his own tongue. He knew she would not understand the words, but he also knew she would understand the tone. He guided the knife with a slowness that was deliberate and gentle, turning a brutal lesson of survival into an act of profound care. He showed her how to respect the animal's life, how to use every part, how nothing was wasted. For Ilara, the moment was a revelation. As she felt the calluses on his palm, the controlled strength in his fingers, the gentle vibration of his voice, the knot of fear inside her began to slowly, miraculously, unwind. For the first time since her family had died, she felt something other than terror or grief. She felt safe, completely and utterly safe. The world was still a dangerous and unforgiving place, but in the circle of this man's patient presence, she had found a sanctuary. It was a quiet climax, a silent shifting of the earth beneath their feet. Their relationship was no longer that of rescuer and victim, or captor and captive. It was something far more complex, and infinitely more human. As autumn bled fully into the high desert, the nights grew cold enough to bite. One evening, the sky, which had been clear and starry, turned a bruised purple. The air grew heavy and still. Then, a sudden violent thunderstorm rolled down from the mountains, unleashing a torrential downpour. The shallow overhang of their camp offered little protection from the driving rain and wind. Water streamed down the rock face, and the small fire hissed and died. They were forced to huddle together in the driest corner of the alcove, a single heavy buffalo hide pulled over them. The cold was immediate and penetrating, shivering. Ilara pressed closer to Kale, seeking his warmth. The fury of the storm outside, the booming thunder, the brilliant flashes of lightning that lit the canyon in stark, ghostly flashes, seemed to break something open inside her. The grief she had held at bay for weeks with the discipline of her small tasks came rushing back. The terror of the storm merged with the terror of her memories, and she began to weep, her sobs silent and racking, the tremors of her crying shaking her whole body. Kale felt the shudders of her grief against his side. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He had none to give. Instead, he simply tightened his arm around her, pulling her closer, offering his own steady warmth as an anchor in the maelstrom. And then he began to chant. It was a low, melodic Apache song, a prayer for protection and peace. The song was ancient and beautiful, a river of sound that seemed to flow around them, pushing back against the violence of the storm. The notes rose and fell with the rhythm of a human heart, a sound of deep and resonant power. Ilara did not understand a single word, but she understood the intent. She understood the comfort being offered. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her grief pouring out of her in a cleansing, silent flood. He held her, his arm a solid, unmoving presence, his song a shield against the dark. He held her and absorbed her pain, his own deep sorrow a silent harmony to hers. There in the shared darkness, surrounded by the storm's fury, they found a fragile sanctuary in each other. It was a moment of pure intimacy, a closeness that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with the solace of one lonely soul finding another. The world outside their canyon finally found them. One bright, cold afternoon, Kale was on a high ledge, scanning the plains below. When he froze, Ilara, who was gathering firewood near the camp, saw the change in his posture. He had gone from a relaxed observer to a predator, utterly still and alert. He motioned to her with a sharp, urgent gesture. "Leave everything. Come." He hustled her deeper into the labyrinth of canyons, his movements swift and silent. For 2 days, they hid in a narrow crevice between two massive boulders, a space so tight they were pressed against each other. They had only a small water skin and a handful of jerky. Ilara saw a side of Kale she had never seen before. The quiet, gentle man of their camp was gone, replaced by the wary, hunted warrior. The casual ease was replaced by a lethal stillness, his eyes constantly scanning the rocks above, his ears tuned to the slightest sound. She saw the deep, cold hatred in his gaze as he watched a distant patrol of blue-coated cavalrymen move across the mouth of the canyon. The hatred was mingled with a fear that was not for himself, but for her. She understood, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that these were the men who had destroyed his family. These were the men who had left Nalin and Taza in the snow. The incident was a brutal reminder of the world they lived in. For Kale, it was a reaffirmation of his belief that the white world brought only death and sorrow. For Ilara, it was a terrible complication. By birth, by blood, she was one of them. Yet her life, her very survival, was now inextricably bound to a man they would shoot on sight. The shared danger, the silent, cramped hours spent hiding from a common enemy, forged a new and fiercer layer to their bond. When the patrol finally rode on and the threat passed, the relief that washed over them was immense, but the illusion of their perfect, isolated peace had been shattered forever. In the days that followed, a new tension settled between them. Kale became more distant, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. He knew he could not keep her here forever. Sooner or later, someone else would find them. It was too dangerous for him, but even more so for her. He began to form a plan. He had heard of a mining town, a place called Sanctuario, far to the south. It was a rough place, but the rumors said it was more tolerant than the army forts, a town where a person's past was their own business. He would take her there, leave her where she would be safe among her own kind. The thought of it filled him with a hollow ache he had not expected. He had grown accustomed to her presence, to the quiet rhythm of their shared days. The silence of the camp had once been a comfort. Now, the thought of returning to it, of being utterly alone again, felt like a kind of death. Ilara sensed the change in him. One evening, she heard him speaking to his horse, and she heard the name of the town, Sanctuario. She did not know the word, but from his gestures, pointing south, then making a motion of walking away and leaving her behind, she understood his intent. A cold dread, sharp and painful, seized her. The thought of returning to civilization was no longer a comfort. It was a terror. The world of white men was the world that had coughed up the cholera that killed her family. The world of greed and broken wagons and false promises. This camp, this harsh and beautiful land, and this silent, gentle man who had saved her and taught her how to live again. This was her home now. He was her protector, her only anchor in the world. He believed he was doing the right thing, the only thing, to ensure her safety. But to her, it felt like a looming abandonment, a second great loss that she was not sure she had the strength to survive. Their journey out of the wilderness was about to begin, and with it, a confrontation with a world that would not understand them, and with feelings for each other that they had not yet dared to name. The journey south was a silent argument, a thing of heavy glances and unspoken fears. They left the relative safety of their hidden canyon and moved under the cover of darkness. Two small figures in a vast and indifferent land. Kale led them along the high, wind-swept ridges, avoiding the open flats where they might be seen. By day, they would find a shallow cave or a thicket of scrub oak to hide in, sleeping in shifts, never lighting a fire. The landscape itself seemed to mourn their passage, shifting from the familiar red rock and towering saguaros of the low desert to the sparse, hardy woodlands of the higher elevations. The air grew thinner, cooler, scented with the sharp, clean smell of piñón and juniper. The shared hardship, the constant vigilance, did not drive them apart as Ilara had feared. Instead, it bound them closer. They became a single unit of survival, their movements and thoughts attuned to one another. Kale navigated the treacherous, moonlit terrain with an innate certainty, his feet seeming to know the location of every solid rock, every loose patch of scree. He was the unquestioned guide, the protector. But Ilara, her senses now sharpened by months in the wild, became his second set of eyes. She, who had once been blind to the rhythms of this world, now noticed the unnatural stillness of birds that signaled a predator nearby, or the faint scent of rain on a distant wind. She was no longer a burden. She was a partner. They made a cold camp one night in a narrow wash littered with boulders. Elara, weary to her bones, stepped down from a rock ledge, and her ankle, weakened by a sprain she had suffered as a girl, gave way beneath her. She cried out, a sharp, involuntary sound that was swallowed by the silence, as a hot, searing pain shot up her leg. She crumpled to the ground, biting her lip to keep from crying out again. Kale was beside her in an instant, a silent, dark shape in the moonlight. He knelt and gently took her foot in his hands. His examination was swift and clinical, his fingers probing the swelling joint with a practiced pressure that was surprisingly gentle. He had tended to injuries like this 100 times before, on warriors and horses alike, but this was different. The feel of her soft skin, the sight of her face pale with pain in the moonlight, stirred something protective in him. He left her for a moment and returned with a handful of leaves he had pulled from a low-growing shrub. He chewed them into a dark, fragrant pulp, then applied the poultice to her swollen ankle. He wrapped it all tightly with soft strips of leather from his pouch, his touch firm and infinitely reassuring. "It will be all right," he said, using his own language. The words were for his own benefit, but the tone was for hers. She could not walk. They were forced to rest. The next day, Kale carried her on his back, her arms looped around his neck, and found them a better shelter, an ancient cliff dwelling, carved like a swallow's nest high up on a sheer rock face. It was a home built by a people long vanished, a series of small, interconnected rooms with a low wall that opened onto a breathtaking view of the valley below. It was a safe, defensible place, hidden from the world. The enforced stillness of the next few days became a crucible for all the unspoken things between them, sheltered from the elements and the eyes of the world, with nothing to do but wait for her ankle to heal. The emotional walls they had so carefully maintained began to crumble. The silence was no longer one of wary observation. It was thick with burgeoning feeling. One evening, they sat before a small, smokeless fire Kale had built deep inside one of the dwelling's inner rooms. The firelight flickered across the stone walls, painting them in warm, dancing colors. It cast his face in a sharp relief of light and shadow. Elara found her gaze drawn to the silvery scars that crisscrossed the burnished skin of his chest. They were a part of him she had never asked about, a map of a life she did not know, gathering a courage she did not know she possessed. She pointed to a long, thin scar near his heart. "How?" she asked, the single word soft in the quiet space. Kale looked down at his chest, then back at her. For a long moment, he said nothing, and she thought he would ignore her, that she had crossed a line. But then he began to speak, not just with his voice, but with his hands, with a stick drawing pictures in the dust, with the few words they shared. He did not just describe the raid, he took her there. He drew a circle for the camp, small stick figures for the wickiups. He made the sound of the bugle, a harsh, ugly noise in his throat. He showed her with his hands how the soldiers on horseback had come at dawn, a wave of blue and steel. His voice, usually so calm, was raw with the memory of it. He spoke of the smell, smoke and gunpowder and the coppery scent of blood on the frozen air. He spoke of the screams. He drew two small figures, a woman and a child, running. He traced the path of a bullet. He stopped, his hand hovering over the drawing of the woman, Nalin. As he told the story, the stoic mask he wore in the world dissolved. The deep, ancient sadness she had always seen in his eyes overflowed. A single tear escaped and traced a clean path through the dust on his cheek. It was the first time she had ever seen him cry, the first time he had shown her the full, raw depth of his wound. He was not just a warrior, not just a survivor. He was a man who had lost his entire world. Her own heart ached with a pain so sharp it felt like her own. Without thinking, she reached across the small space between them and laid her hand gently on his. His skin was warm, his hand steady beneath hers. Then, looking into his eyes, she began to share her own story. She spoke in English, knowing he would not understand the words, but trusting that he would feel the current of her sorrow. She told him about her father's booming laugh and his big, impossible dreams. She told him about her mother's garden, about the way she used to hum while she canned peaches. She told him about Thomas, about his missing front tooth and his obsession with grasshoppers, how he had been so excited to see a real Indian. Her voice broke on her brother's name. She spoke of the sickness, the helplessness, the crushing weight of the silence after they were all gone. In that small, firelit room, carved from the living rock, they ceased to be Apache and white woman, enemy and other. They were simply two people, their souls scoured and hollowed out by grief, finding a fragile, desperate solace in the presence of the only other person in the world who could possibly understand the depth of their loss. The nights in the high country were cold, a deep, biting chill that seeped into their bones. They slept close together, their separate bedrolls pushed into one, sharing the warmth of the heavy buffalo hide and their own bodies. It was a closeness born not of desire, but of a desperate, elemental need for comfort and connection in the vast, lonely dark. One night, Cale was pulled from a shallow sleep by a sound. It was Alara, whimpering beside him, trapped in the coils of a nightmare. He could feel the frantic, rabbit-quick pounding of her heart against his back, the tension in her limbs as she struggled against some unseen terror. Instinct, older and deeper than thought, took over. He turned and pulled her into his arms, gathering her against his chest. She felt small and fragile, trembling like a leaf. He held her securely, his arm a solid band around her, and began to murmur to her in his language, the same soft, soothing words he had once used to comfort his son. He stroked her hair, his hand moving in a slow, steady rhythm, until the panicked, shallow breaths she was taking began to deepen and her body relaxed against his. She sank back into a peaceful sleep, safe in the circle of his embrace. He did not sleep for a long time after. He lay there in the quiet dark, listening to the soft sound of her breathing, watching her face in the faint moonlight that filtered into the cave. Her features were relaxed in sleep, peaceful, the lines of sorrow and fear erased for a few precious hours. An emotion, fierce and powerful, swelled in his chest. It was a tenderness so profound it was almost painful, a protective urge that was both exhilarating and terrifying. He had thought that part of him was dead, that his heart had been buried in the frozen ground with Nalan and Taza. He had built a wall of ice and stone around the memory of his love, believing it was the only way to survive. But this woman, this fragile survivor from the world of his enemies, had slipped through the cracks. She had, slowly and quietly, without even trying, brought his heart back to life. He was falling in love with her. The realization struck him with the force of a physical blow. It frightened him more than any soldier's rifle, more than the prospect of starvation or a lonely death. To love was to be vulnerable. To love was to have something to lose, and he did not think he could survive losing everything again. When Alara's ankle was strong enough to bear her weight, they continued their journey south. As they descended from the high country, the signs of the white world began to appear, like ugly scars on the pristine beauty of the land. They crossed the deep ruts of a wagon road. They heard the distant, rhythmic ring of a prospector's pickaxe echoing from a hillside. They passed through a stand of ancient pines where dozens of trees had been felled, their massive trunks left to rot, a testament to a careless, casual destruction that Cale could not comprehend. The change in the landscape was mirrored by a change in him. The easy companionship they had found in the cliff dwelling vanished, replaced by a grim, brooding tension. He became more withdrawn, his silence heavier, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon with a wary, hunted look. Alara felt his turmoil as if it were her own. She knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that he was walking toward a world that had only ever offered him betrayal and death. He was doing this for her, and the sacrifice was a weight on her heart. A rising panic began to build inside her, the thought of Sanctuario, which had once been a vague and distant goal, was now a terrifyingly real destination. The prospect of their separation became an open wound. She did not want the safety of a town if it meant losing him. The gratitude she had felt for him as her savior, the dependence she had felt on him as her protector, had over the long weeks and shared trials crystallized into something deeper, something far more powerful. She loved him. She loved his quiet strength, his surprising gentleness, the profound sadness in his eyes that mirrored her own. She could not imagine a life without him. The thought of being alone again, surrounded by the babble of her own people, was a prospect more terrifying than starving in the desert. The night before they were to reach the town, they made their final camp in a secluded grove of cottonwood trees near a small, gurgling creek. The air was thick with unspoken farewells. The emotional tension that had been simmering between them for days finally reached its boiling point. They ate their sparse meal in silence, the crackle of the small fire the only sound. Finally, Ilara could bear it no longer. She looked at him across the fire, her heart in her eyes. The firelight played on his face, illuminating the hard lines of his jaw, the deep sorrow in his gaze. Tears welled up, blurring his image. "Cale," she said. It was the first time she had spoken his name aloud, and it came out as a ragged whisper, thick with all the emotion she could no longer contain. He looked up, his dark eyes meeting hers, and in her gaze, in the glistening tears that traced paths down her dusty cheeks, he saw a perfect reflection of his own soul. He saw love, he saw fear, and he saw a desperate, wrenching desire not to let go. The years of loneliness, the fortress of grief he had built around his heart, crumbled to dust in that single, shared look. He rose and came around the fire, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. He knelt before her, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. His thumb moved with infinite gentleness to wipe away a tear. The touch was electric, a current of pure, undeniable truth passing between them. He leaned down and kissed her. The kiss was not explosive or demanding. It was hesitant at first, a soft, searching pressure of his lips on hers. Then, as she responded, as her hand came up to rest on his shoulder, it deepened. It was a kiss that held all the pent-up longing of their lonely souls, all the shared sorrow they had carried, all the unspoken words that had passed between them in the long, quiet weeks. It was a kiss of recognition, of 2 halves of a shattered whole finding each other in the most unlikely of places. It was a desperate affirmation of life in the face of so much death, a seal on a bond that had been forged in the heart of the wilderness. That night, under a canopy of brilliant cold stars, they made love. The act was as tender and as vulnerable as their first kiss. There was no shame, no fear, only a profound and overwhelming sense of coming home. For Ilara, it was a reclaiming of a body that had known only pain and hardship, a discovery of an intimacy built on a foundation of absolute trust and safety. For Cale, it was a reawakening of a part of himself he thought had been buried forever, a moment of such deep connection that it eased the gnawing ache of his solitude. It was a healing, a quiet, sacred ceremony performed by 2 survivors. Afterward, they lay tangled in each other's arms, wrapped in the buffalo hide, their bodies still humming with the aftershocks of their embrace. The silence that returned was not empty. It was full, peaceful, brimming with possibility. For the first time, the future did not feel like a threat, but like an open door. He looked down at her, her head resting on his chest, and she looked up at him. They did not need words. They made a pact in that shared, steady gaze. They would not separate. They would not say goodbye. They would walk into this new, dangerous world together. The fragile, defiant glimmer of hope, born in the darkest of places, had finally, against all odds, ignited into a flame. Their love story had truly begun. But as the first pale light of dawn touched the horizon, they both knew that so had their greatest struggle. The hope of the previous night died on the outskirts of Sanctuario. The town was not a sanctuary. It was an open wound on the land, a collection of raw, unpainted wooden buildings thrown up without plan or care. The main street was a river of thick, brown mud, littered with garbage and the droppings of horses and mules. The clean, profound silence of the wilderness was replaced by a constant, jarring clamor, the clang of a blacksmith's hammer, the raw-throated shouts of mule drivers, the tinny, frantic sound of a piano tumbling from a saloon doorway. The air, which for months had been clean and scented with pine and dust, was now thick and foul, a choking mixture of coal smoke, cheap whiskey, stale sweat, and offal. For Alara, the sensory assault was overwhelming. She felt a desperate urge to cover her ears, to press a cloth over her nose. After so long in the vast, quiet emptiness, this concentration of humanity felt suffocating, diseased. For Cale, the reaction was different. He saw the town not as ugly, but as a violation. It was the physical manifestation of the blight his people had been fighting for generations, a symbol of the greed and waste that had poisoned the land and his life. He walked beside Alara, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, but his body was rigid, his eyes narrowed into a warrior's vigilant slits. The gentleness he had shown her in the wild was gone, replaced by a hard, protective shell. They became a spectacle the moment they were seen. Men lounging on the boardwalk stopped talking and turned to stare. Their faces held a mixture of slack-jawed curiosity and a sneering contempt that was as sharp as a physical blow. Words were muttered, just loud enough to carry on the fetid air. "Look at that. Buck's got himself a white squaw." "She been captured, you reckon?" The words were stones thrown at them, ugly and meant to hurt. Cale's jaw tightened, but his expression did not change. He had expected this. Women, clutching baskets or pulling children by the hand, would stop and glare, pulling their sons and daughters closer as if Cale were a plague. They looked at Alara with a different kind of venom, a mixture of pity and scorn. They saw a fallen woman, a creature tainted and ruined, a charity case to be clucked over and judged. The fragile, beautiful intimacy they had forged under the stars evaporated under the harsh, cruel glare of this new world. There was only one place to go. Cale had been given the name of the town's doctor by a trader years ago, a man who had a reputation for minding his own business. They found the clinic at the far end of the street, a slightly more solid-looking building with a porch and a weathered sign that read, "Dr. Elias Thorne." The man who answered their knock was tall and stooped, with a fringe of gray hair and a face so deeply lined it looked like a dried-up riverbed. His eyes were tired and cynical, the eyes of a man who had seen too much bleeding and dying to be impressed by anything. He looked from Cale's proud, stony face to Alara's exhausted, frightened one, and then took in her tattered dress and the Apache moccasins on her feet. He grunted, a sound that held no surprise. "Trouble finds this town from every direction," he said, his voice a dry rasp. He listened to Alara's halting, simplified story, lost, found, needing a place to stay. He did not ask for details he knew she would not give. Doctor. Thorne was a pragmatist. Skin color and past history were of little interest to him. He dealt in the currency of sickness and injury, and it was a currency that made all men equal. "She can have the back room," he said, nodding toward a door. "She can help me. I need someone to boil bandages and clean up messes. God knows there are enough of them." He looked at Cale. "He can stay in the stable out back, but he keeps to himself. This town is a powder keg, and a man like him is a lit match." The decision earned Dr. Thorne a fresh round of suspicion from the townspeople, but he was indifferent to their opinions. The clinic and the small, dusty stable became their precarious sanctuary. But Sanctuario itself was a prison. Cale spent his days in the stable, mending the doctor's tack or caring for his horse, a prisoner of the four wooden walls. To step out into the street was to invite a confrontation, a drunken challenge, a spat of tobacco juice aimed at his feet. The only time he moved freely was at night, when he would slip out of the stable and stand in the shadows outside Alara's window, a silent, watchful guardian. Alara faced a torment of a different kind. The women of the town, led by Martha Brody, the pious and imposing wife of the town's founder and sheriff, decided Ilara was a project. They saw her as a brand to be plucked from the burning, a soul to be saved. They descended on the clinic in a rustle of starched skirts and self-righteousness, bearing gifts of old dresses, worn Bibles, and pots of thin, flavorless stew. Their charity was a weapon, and their kindness was a veneer for a prurient, invasive curiosity. "You poor, dear child," Martha Brody would say, her voice dripping with a sympathy that felt like acid. "To have endured such an ordeal, you must tell us everything. How did that savage treat you?" They would lean in, their eyes gleaming, hungry for details of her supposed violation. They could not conceive of any other kind of relationship. Ilara's quiet defiance only hardened their resolve. "He was kind to me," she would say, her voice low and steady. "He saved my life." This was not the answer they wanted. It confused and angered them. They saw her not as a survivor, but as a sinner, unrepentant and perhaps even corrupted. Her refusal to denounce Cale, to play the part of the grateful, redeemed captive, served only to isolate her further. She was among her own people, yet she had never felt so utterly alone. The only solace was the night, when she would lie in her small, lumpy bed and know that he was just outside, a few yards away, a silent presence that was the only real home she had. The central tragedy of their lives arrived on the back of a tired horse. His name was Jedediah Kane, and he was a bounty hunter, a man who made his living from death. He and the 3 thugs who rode with him were hard, cruel men with cold eyes and faces burned by the sun and whiskey. They rode into town not like visitors, but like a conquering army, their saddles adorned with the gruesome trophies of their trade. Sheriff Brody, a weak, ambitious man with a tin star and a paunch, greeted them with a nervous deference. Brody governed through bluster and fear, and he saw in Kane a powerful, ruthless ally who could help him solidify his own shaky authority. Kane's gaze swept the town, and it was not long before it fell upon the doctor's stable. He saw Cale, standing in the doorway, and a slow, ugly smile spread across his face. He did not know Cale's name, but he knew the man's tribe. Kane had a personal, burning hatred for the Chiricahua, a vendetta born from a skirmish years ago that had left him with a limp and a festering sense of humiliation. He saw Cale not as a person, but as an opportunity, a chance to collect a bounty, to exercise his cruelty, and to terrorize the town into a state of profitable submission. He and his men began a campaign of calculated harassment. They would lounge near the stable, drinking and making loud, lewd remarks about Ilara. They would taunt Cale, calling him every vile name they could think of, trying to provoke him into a fight. A fight would be all the justification Sheriff Brody needed to look the other way while Kane killed him. For Ilara's sake, Cale endured it all with a stoic, simmering rage. He would stand in the shadows of the stable, his hands clenched into fists, his body a coiled spring of violence that he fought to control. The provocations were a fire licking at his feet, and it took every ounce of his discipline not to react. Ilara saw the danger as clearly as if it were a physical thing. She saw the malice in Kane's eyes and the weakness in the sheriff's. "Please," she begged Cale one night, her voice a desperate whisper at her window. "Let us go. We can go back to the mountains. We were safe there." But Cale shook his head, his face grim. "He will hunt us, and you will not be safe out there alone if something happens to me. Here, with the doctor, you have some protection." He refused to leave her. Their love, which had been their greatest strength in the wilderness, had now become the anchor that held him in this dangerous place, chained to a fate he could not outrun. The situation reached its breaking point on a hot, dusty afternoon. A 7-year-old boy, the son of the town blacksmith, went missing. He had, in fact, simply chased a lizard too far and fallen asleep in the loft of a hay barn on the edge of town. But his mother's frantic cries of alarm were the only spark Kane and Brody needed to set the town ablaze. They seized on the opportunity instantly. Within minutes, the story was flying from one end of the street to the other, twisted and amplified with each telling. It was not a lost boy anymore. It was a kidnapping, and the culprit was obvious. "The Apache savage has him," Kane bellowed from the steps of the saloon. "He's taken the boy for some dark, heathen ritual." It was a lie so blatant, so monstrous, that it should have been laughable. But the town was primed with fear and suspicion. Kane and the sheriff fanned the flames, whipping the townsfolk into a frenzy of righteous, whiskey-fueled fury. A mob formed, a hydra-headed monster of men with flushed faces and hate-filled eyes, armed with pistols, shotguns, and farm implements. They marched on the doctor's clinic, their boots churning the dusty street into a cloud. "Doctor." Thorne met them on his porch, his face a mask of weary disgust. "Go home, you fools," he spat. "You're drunk. The man has done nothing." He was shoved aside, sent stumbling back into his office. The mob surged past him. Half a dozen men stormed the stable. Ilara, hearing the commotion, ran to the door of the clinic just as they dragged Cale out into the street. He was not fighting them, knowing it would be useless, his face a cold, proud mask of contempt. "No!" Ilara screamed, a raw, tearing sound. "Leave him alone! He did nothing!" She tried to fight her way to him, to throw herself between him and the mob, but she was grabbed from behind. Martha Brody and two other women held her arms in a grip of iron. "It's for your own good, child," Martha said, her face a grotesque mask of piety. "He is a devil. We are saving you from him." The scene dissolved into chaos and brutality. Ilara fought and clawed, but they held her fast. The mob dragged Cale down the street to the central hitching post in front of the sheriff's office. They tied his hands high above his head, stretching his body taut. What followed was the story's darkest hour. Kane, playing the role of both judge and executioner, conducted a horrific mock trial, screaming accusations that were met with roars of approval from the drunken mob. Then, the torture began. They beat him with fists and knotted ropes. They spit on him. Kane took a lit cigar from his mouth and deliberately pressed it into Cale's shoulder, then another into his ribs. The narration of this horror focused not on the graphic details of the violence, but on the two souls at its center. Cale, enduring an agony that would have broken any other man, went somewhere else in his mind. He detached himself from his screaming nerves, from the pain and the humiliation. He focused on a single point of light in the darkness. Ilara. He saw her face as it had been in the firelight of the cliff dwelling. He felt the memory of her touch, the sound of her voice saying his name. He was not enduring this for himself. He was enduring it for her. He would not give his tormentors the satisfaction of hearing him scream. He would not let them break him. Ilara was forced to watch it all from the window of the clinic, held captive by two of the sheriff's deputies. Her powerlessness was a physical thing, a crushing weight that stole the air from her lungs. Every blow that landed on Cale's body, she felt in her own. The sound of the rope striking his skin was a crack in her own soul. Her love for him, the most beautiful thing she had ever known, was now a source of excruciating, unbearable agony. She screamed until her voice was a raw, shredded whisper. She dug her nails into her own arms, oblivious to the blood, the world dissolving into a red haze of horror and impotent rage. This was the ultimate test of their bond. Not a test of choice or devotion, but of endurance in the face of a cruelty so absolute, so senseless, it defied reason. Just as Kane was shaking out a noose, preparing to finish the job, a shout came from the end of the street. It was the blacksmith. He had found his son, safe and sound, waking from a nap in the hayloft. For a moment, the mob's bloodlust faltered. A confused murmur ran through the crowd. They had been about to lynch an innocent man. But Kane was not about to be cheated of his prize. "He's still guilty," he roared. "If not of this, then of 100 other crimes. He's an Apache. That's crime enough." Before the mob could regain its momentum, the front door of the clinic flew open. "Doctor." Thorne stood there, a double-barreled shotgun held steady in his hands, his face a thundercloud of cold fury that surprised everyone. "Get away from him," he said, his voice low and deadly. "Get away from him now. You're a pack of savage, bloodthirsty animals. You make me ashamed to be a man. Sheriff, you cut that man down, or so help me God. I will blow a hole in your worthless hide you could drive a wagon through." Sheriff Brody, seeing the mood of the crowd shift from righteous fury to sullen shame, and fearing the consequences of having lynched a man now publicly proven innocent, made a quick calculation. He sullenly nodded to his deputies. "Cut him down." They cut the ropes, and Cale's body fell, a broken, bleeding heap in the mud of the street. The crowd, suddenly sober and ashamed, began to melt away, unable to look at what they had done. Ilara finally broke free from the women who held her. She ran to him, stumbling through the mud, and fell to her knees at his side. She gathered his unconscious, brutalized body into her arms, cradling his bloody head in her lap. The street was suddenly, unnervingly quiet. The only sound was the sound of her own silent, grief-stricken sobs, tears washing clean tracks through the grime on her face. The fragile flame of hope they had carried into this town had been utterly and cruelly extinguished, leaving behind only a profound and devastating tragedy that had scarred them both, perhaps beyond repair. The aftermath of the attack was a grim, silent hell, with Dr. Thorne's help, his face a mask of cold fury. Ilara half-carried, half-dragged Cale's broken body back to the clinic. The building, which had offered a brief illusion of safety, now felt like a besieged fortress, the hostile silence of the town pressing in on all sides. The world beyond their door ceased to exist. For the next several weeks, Ilara's universe shrank to the confines of a small, dim sick room, the air thick with the smell of herbs, blood, and carbolic soap. This time became a testament to a strength Ilara never knew she possessed, a strength forged in the fire of her love. She became his sole caretaker, a fierce and tireless guardian of his flickering life. The harrowing process of his recovery was a blur of grim tasks that she performed with an unwavering, almost mechanical focus. She cleaned the deep, ragged wounds, her stomach churning at the sight of torn flesh and bruised muscle. With a needle and thread provided by Dr. Thorne, she stitched his skin back together, her hands surprisingly steady, her focus absolute. She learned to feel for the grating of his broken ribs, binding his chest tightly with strips of linen. She spooned thin, nourishing broth, drop by drop, between his swollen, cracked lips, praying he would swallow. Her grief, the raw, screaming agony she had felt watching him being tortured, was channeled into this relentless determination. She did not weep. She did not have the time. All her energy, every fiber of her being, was bent toward a single purpose, keeping him alive. She rarely slept, dozing in a chair by his bedside for an hour or two at a time, waking at the slightest sound or change in his breathing. She spent the long, dark hours of the night watching over him, talking to him in a low, constant murmur. She told him stories of the mountains, of the way the sun looked rising over the canyon, of the taste of fresh water from the spring. She was willing him to come back to her, her voice a lifeline cast into the dark, turbulent waters where he was drowning. Dr. Thorne provided the medical knowledge, the salves and the laudanum for the pain, but he knew his science was only part of the equation. He would watch her, this slip of a girl with haunted eyes and hands stained with her lover's blood, and the thick shell of his cynicism would crack. He saw a devotion so pure and so powerful that it was its own kind of medicine, more potent than anything in his black bag. He saw her resilience, and for the first time in many years, he felt a profound and grudging admiration for the human spirit. Cale was trapped in a red-tinged twilight, his body a landscape of pure, unrelenting pain. His mind was a battlefield. Fragmented images of the attack assaulted him. The snarling, contorted faces of the mob, the searing agony of the cigar burns, the tightening of the rope that had nearly ended his life. These memories were interwoven with another, more seductive vision. He saw a sunlit meadow, green and peaceful, a place he had never been. His wife, Nalin, was there, her smile as beautiful as he remembered it. His son, Taza, was laughing, running toward him with his arms outstretched. They were calling to him, their voices soft and welcoming, beckoning him to leave the world of pain and join them in the spirit world. He was caught between two worlds, torn between the peaceful oblivion of death and the terrible agony of life. The pull toward his lost family was immense, a siren song of rest and release. But through the roar of his own pain, he could hear another sound, faint but persistent. A voice, Ilara's voice. It was a thread, a lifeline pulling him back from the precipice. He fought to live, not for himself, but for her. He could not leave her alone in this cruel world. The journey back to consciousness was slow, agonizing, a climb up a sheer cliff face with bleeding hands. One afternoon, weeks after the attack, he opened his eyes. The delirium receded like a foul tide, leaving behind the shores of reality. The first thing he saw was not the ceiling, not the room, but her. Ilara was asleep in the chair beside his bed, her head slumped forward at an uncomfortable angle. Her beautiful, sun-bleached hair was matted and dull. There were dark, bruised-looking circles under her eyes, and her face was thin and pale with exhaustion. She was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. He tried to speak her name, but his throat was raw, his lips too stiff to form the word. He managed a faint, croaking sound. It was enough. Her eyes flew open. They were wide, startled, then filled with a dawning, incredulous light. She stared at him. Her lips parted, as if she could not believe what she was seeing. He tried again, forcing air from his lungs, forcing his tongue and lips to work. "Ilara," he whispered. The sound was barely audible, a dry rustle of breath. The single word broke the spell of her exhaustion. A great, shuddering sob escaped her, a sound of relief so profound it was painful. She leaned forward, her hands hovering over him as if afraid to touch, her tears falling freely onto the rough blanket that covered him. The moment was quiet, devoid of grand pronouncements or passionate declarations. It was simply a powerful, elemental recognition of survival. They were both alive, and for now, that was more than enough. As the weeks turned into a month, Kale's body began to heal. The wounds closed, the bruises faded, and the strength slowly returned to his limbs. But as the physical injuries mended, the deeper, psychological scars became more apparent. The man who had emerged from the fever was not the same one who had entered it. The quiet gentleness that had defined him was still there, but it was now overlaid with a brittle, defensive hardness. He was haunted. He would wake in the night, drenched in sweat, the screams of the mob still ringing in his ears. During the day, he would fall into long fits of silent, brooding anger, his eyes distant and cold. He was consumed by a shame that gnawed at his soul. The helplessness he had felt, tied to that post, had been a violation far deeper than any physical blow. It had stripped him of his pride, of his identity as a warrior and a protector, and that shame curdled into an all-consuming desire for vengeance. He thought of Jedediah Cain, and a cold, murderous rage would settle in his gut. He wanted to make Cain pay, not just for the pain but for the humiliation. Ilara, too, was irrevocably changed. The soft, frightened girl who had stumbled out of the desert was gone forever. In her place was a woman forged in trauma and rage. The pity she had once felt for the townspeople had transformed into a burning, contemptuous hatred. She saw their hypocritical piety, the way they would now cross the street to avoid the clinic, their faces a mixture of guilt and fear. She hated them for their weakness, for their cruelty, for what they had done to the man she loved. Their shared trauma created a new, darker bond between them. They found solace only in each other's presence, clinging together in the dark of the small room. Their love became their shield, a fragile fortress against the memory of the horror they had endured. Ilara knew, with a cold certainty, that there could be no justice for Cale and Sanctuario. The law was a joke, embodied by Sheriff Brody, a man who had not only allowed the attack but had been complicit in it. To appeal to him would be a futile, dangerous act. If they were to have justice, if they were ever to be safe, they would have to find it themselves. The thought terrified her. But the alternative, living in constant fear, waiting for Cain to decide to finish what he had started, was unbearable. While Cale was still confined to his bed, his anger a poison with no outlet, Ilara began to move. She started with the stable hand who worked at the livery, a young, timid man who had always been kind to her. She would bring him a plate of food, ask him questions, her voice soft, her manner casual. She learned that Cain and his men were boasting in the saloon, planning to ride out in a few days to hunt for bounties down near the Mexican border. A desperate, dangerous plan began to form in her mind. One afternoon, while cleaning the clinic's main room, she found Cale's knife. Doctor. Thorne had recovered it from the street after the attack and had put it away in a drawer. She took it, slipping it into the folds of her dress. The flint blade was cold and heavy in her hand. That night, and for every night that followed, she would go out to the stable, and by the light of a single, shrouded lantern, she would practice. She held the knife, learned its balance. Her actions were not born of a cold-blooded desire for revenge. It was something more primal. It was the fierce animal instinct to protect her mate, to eliminate the threat. It was a desperate need to reclaim a sense of agency in a world that had rendered her completely powerless. She knew, with every fiber of her being, that as long as Jedediah Cain was alive, they would never be safe. The climax came a week later. Cale was finally strong enough to walk, to move around the clinic, though his body was still stiff and sore. He found her in the stable, the knife in her hand, her face a mask of fierce concentration as she practiced a thrust against a sack of grain. The look on his face was a mixture of shock, fear, and a dawning, horrified understanding. "What are you doing?" he demanded, his voice a harsh rasp. "What must be done?" she said, her own voice steady, though her heart was hammering. He forbade it. He was terrified of losing her, of her getting hurt. "This is not your fight," he growled. "Vengeance is my burden to bear. He is mine." "No!" she shot back, her new, hard-won strength flaring into anger. "Your life is too precious to risk. You are not strong enough. This is my fight, too. He hurt you, so he hurt me." They had their first real fight, their pain and fear and love erupting into a storm of angry, desperate words. In the end, it was not anger that won, but a shared, terrible resolve. They would face him together. He pulled her into a fierce, desperate embrace, and their pact was sealed with a kiss that tasted of salt and sorrow. 2 days later, they tracked Cain's gang to their camp a day's ride from town. It was a slovenly camp in a rocky canyon, the men drunk and careless around a large fire, using the fieldcraft Cale had taught her, the art of moving like a shadow. They crept toward the camp under the cover of darkness. The plan was to create a diversion, to pick them off one by one. But the plan went wrong. A nervous horse whinnied, a dog barked, and suddenly the camp exploded into a chaos of shouts and gunfire. They were discovered. A brutal, chaotic fight erupted in the flickering firelight. Cale, his movements still hampered by his healing ribs, took on 2 of the men at once, his knife a blur of dark flint. He fought with a cold, contained fury, a warrior reawakened. Ilara found herself facing Cain himself. He had a pistol in one hand and a large skinning knife in the other. He saw her, saw the knife she held, and he laughed, a loud, ugly sound. "Well, look what we have here," he sneered. "The little dove has grown claws." His arrogance was his undoing. He underestimated her. He saw the woman, not the survivor, fueled by a torrent of adrenaline and a pure, cold rage. Ilara did not hesitate. She did not think. She reacted. She ducked under the wild swing of his knife and lunged forward, not with the clumsiness of a novice, but with the deadly purpose of a predator. She used the skills Cale had taught her, the lessons of balance and leverage, of striking at the vulnerable points, skills she had learned for hunting animals, not men. He was shocked by her ferocity. He backpedaled, his sneer turning to a snarl of surprise, in a desperate life-or-death struggle, as he raised his pistol to fire. She drove Cale's flint knife upward with all her strength, deep into his unprotected side. His eyes went wide with shock and pain. The pistol fired, the shot going wild, and he collapsed to the ground, a look of disbelief on his face. Suddenly, it was over. Cain's men were dead or had fled into the night. The canyon was silent again, the only sound the crackle of the fire and their own ragged, heavy breathing. Cale and Alara stood in the center of the small, bloody clearing, covered in dust and grime. Alara looked down at the dead man at her feet, then at the knife in her trembling hand. It was wet and dark. The reality of what she had done, the finality of it, crashed down on her like a physical blow. The cold rage that had sustained her drained away, leaving her empty and shaking. The knife slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the rocks. A wave of nausea and horror washed over her, and she began to tremble uncontrollably. Cale came to her, ignoring a gash on his own arm. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her tightly as her body was racked with violent shudders. He did not praise her for her bravery. He did not condemn her for the violence. He simply held her, letting her sob against his chest, murmuring to her in Apache, his voice a soft, soothing anchor in the storm that had broken inside her. In that moment, they had saved each other. He had saved her from the wilderness, and she, in turn, had now saved him from the specter of his tormentor, from the poison of a vengeance that might have consumed him. Justice had been served, not by a court of law, not by a sheriff's badge, but by their own hands, in the dark of a lonely canyon. They were bound together now, not just by love and grief, but by the blood they had spilled to protect that love. And as he held her, they both knew, with absolute certainty, that they could never go back. Their only option was to disappear, to flee back into the heart of the wilderness, the only place they had ever truly been safe. They fled south, melting back into the landscape that had birthed him and remade her. They moved deeper into the rugged, folded heart of the Chiricahua Mountains, a world of soaring stone pillars, deep pine forests, and canyons so narrow the sun touched their floors for only an hour a day. This land was both a refuge and a trial, its harsh beauty a balm and its unforgiving nature a constant test. They were fugitives now, from the white man's law that would hang him and condemn her, and from the judgment of their own pasts. The long journey became a process of healing. They tended to the wounds they had sustained in the fight, his stitched arm and her collection of cuts and bruises. But the deeper wounds, the ones in their minds, were slower to mend. Alara was haunted by the ghost of Jedediah Cain. In the quiet of the night, she would see his surprised, dying face, his eyes wide with a final, shocked understanding. She would wake from nightmares, her heart pounding, the phantom weight of the knife still in her hand. She struggled with the violence she had discovered within herself, a capacity for killing that frightened her. It felt like a dark, alien thing had taken root in her soul, and she did not know how to live with it. Cale saw her turmoil, the shadow that had fallen over her spirit. He did not offer her the empty platitudes of her own people, no talk of forgiveness or sin. The world he knew was simpler and harder than that. One evening, as they sat by a small fire, he took her hand and spoke to her of the violence he had known. He told her of his first hunt, of the necessity and the regret of taking a life to sustain his own. He told her of battles, of the cold reality that sometimes, to protect those you love, you must become a thing of violence yourself. He explained to her the concept of balancing the scales. The world, he said, sought its own balance. When a great injustice was done, when a life was filled with cruelty and hate like Cain's, it created a weight on one side. Her act was not a sin that had blackened her soul, it was an act of survival. A desperate, necessary push to restore a terrible balance. She had not killed out of malice, but out of love and a need to defend their life together. You did not invite the wolf into the camp, he told her, his voice low and steady. But when it came, you did what was needed to protect your home. There is no shame in that. There is only sorrow that it was necessary. A few days later, he led her to a small, hidden spring that trickled from a rock face, a place he said was holy. He performed a small, quiet ceremony for her. He washed the dust from her face and hands with the cold, pure water. He burned a bundle of sage, letting the fragrant smoke wash over her, a cleansing ritual to help her spirit release the burden of the killing. As the smoke swirled around her, and he chanted in his low, melodic voice, Ilara felt a sense of peace settle over her, a quiet absolution that no church could ever have offered. It was a moment of shared spiritual intimacy, a profound step in their healing, not just for her, but for him as well. They traveled for weeks until they found it, a hidden valley, a place of almost mythic beauty, nestled so deep within the mountains it felt like the world's first morning. A clear, cold stream, lined with cottonwoods, ran down its center. The meadows were lush with grass, and the game was abundant and unafraid. The valley was walled on 3 sides by sheer cliffs of red and gold rock, dotted with the dark mouths of ancient, sheltering caves. Here, they knew, they could build a life. Here, they could be safe. The process of making their home became a metaphor for rebuilding their lives. Kale, using skills passed down through generations, taught Ilara how to build a wickiup, a sturdy, dome-shaped dwelling made from bent saplings and covered in layers of hide and brush. He taught her how to tan the hides of the deer he hunted until they were soft and supple. He taught her to read the seasons, not by a calendar, but by the angle of the sun and the migration of the birds. Ilara, in turn, brought her own knowledge. From a small cloth pouch she had treasured and protected, she produced a handful of seeds, saved from her mother's garden in Ohio. She found a patch of rich, dark earth near the stream and planted a small garden of squash, beans, and corn. She found ways to make their dwelling more comfortable, weaving mats from river reeds and stuffing sleeping pallets with soft, dry grasses. She had a touch for making a place feel like a home. They worked together, their movements falling into a rhythm of deep, unspoken understanding. There was little need for conversation. A glance, a nod, a shared smile were all that was needed. The grand, dramatic passions of their early days, forged in fear and desperation, now settled and deepened into a quiet, abiding, and peaceful love. Their days were filled with the simple, satisfying work of survival. Their evenings were spent by the fire, sharing a meal, the silence comfortable and complete. At night, they slept in each other's arms, and for the first time, there was no fear, only the profound comfort of belonging. Their life was not an idyllic paradise. It was a life of constant, unrelenting hard work and vigilance. The wilderness was a powerful and unforgiving force. A harsh winter, the first they spent in the valley, tested their preparations to the limit, their food stores dwindling to almost nothing by the time the first spring thaw came. A mountain lion, lean and hungry, began to stalk the edges of their valley, its cry a chilling scream in the night, forcing Kale to spend days tracking and killing it. One autumn, a feverish sickness laid Ilara low for a week, leaving her weak and delirious. Kale was terrified, the old fear of loss roaring back to the surface with a vengeance. He nursed her with a desperate, gentle focus, his fear for her life a testament to how completely she had become the center of his. But they faced each challenge together, their bond strengthening with every trial they overcame. They were no longer defined by the trauma they had survived, but by the life they were actively, consciously creating. In their isolation, they created their own unique culture, a beautiful and seamless blend of his Apache traditions and her remembered settler life. He learned to say the English words, "I love you," his voice soft and hesitant at first, then sure. She, in turn, learned to offer a pinch of cornmeal to the mountain spirits before a hunt, a quiet prayer for his success and his safe return. They were a new tribe, a tribe of two, a living testament to the possibility of bridging two worlds through love. One day, years after they had first come to the valley, Kale returned from a long hunting trip to find he was not alone. A small band of Chiricahua warriors had made camp at the mouth of the valley. His first reaction was a cold knot of fear in his stomach, fear that they would not accept Ilara, that they would see her as an enemy. that they would try to force him to choose between his past and his future. The band was led by an old warrior, a man whose name was already a legend among the whites and his own people, a man with eyes that seemed to see everything. He was wary, but he was also a pragmatist. He saw Cale, saw the new strength and peace in him, a calmness that had not been there before. Then he looked at Alara, who stood beside Cale, her hand resting on his arm, her gaze steady and unafraid. The old warrior's eyes were assessing, like a hunter's. He saw not a helpless white woman, a captive, but a survivor. He saw a woman who was strong in her own right, who stood her ground, who belonged to this land as much as any of them. He saw the way Cale looked at her, and the way she looked back at him. In a moment of unexpected grace, the old warrior gave a short, sharp nod. It was not a greeting of friendship, but it was one of respect. They were not asked to join the band, nor were they driven away. The warriors stayed for 2 days, and when they left a gift of dried meat and salt at the edge of the camp. They had been acknowledged. They had been left in peace. It was a sign that Cale had finally found a measure of reconciliation with his own people, not by returning to their ways, but by forging his own. The years passed as they do in the mountains, marked by the turning of the seasons, the birth of fawns, the falling of the autumn leaves. The final scenes of their story took place when they were in their late middle age. The lines of hardship and the squint of the sun were etched deeply into their faces, but their eyes held a deep, serene contentment that was as vast and as peaceful as their valley. They had children, 2 sons and a daughter, who were a beautiful, perfect blend of their 2 worlds. They grew up speaking both Apache and English, their tongues moving easily between the two. They were skilled with a bow and arrow, taught by their father, and they knew how to tend a garden and mend a fence, taught by their mother. They were a new generation, a bridge between 2 peoples, born of a love that had refused to recognize boundaries. The dark tragedies of the past had not been erased. The memories of loss, of the attack in Sanctuario, of the blood that had been spilled, were a part of their story, scars that they both carried. But the scars had faded. They were no longer the defining feature of their lives. Their love, which had been forged in the crucible of fear and desperation, had matured over the long, quiet years into a partnership of profound respect, easy companionship, and enduring tenderness. The story concludes with a simple, powerful image. Alara and Cale are sitting together on a smooth, sun-warmed rock outside their home, watching the sunset paint the high peaks of the mountains in hues of gold and deep purple. The landscape is the same one that almost killed her so many years ago, the same one that was the backdrop to so much pain and fear. But now, it is unequivocally, completely, their home. He reaches over and takes her hand. His is weathered and calloused, hers is slender and strong. His touch is as gentle and as sure as it was the day he first taught her how to survive. There is no need for words. Their life together is a conversation that has never ended. They have survived everything: grief, prejudice, hatred, and violence. They have taken the broken pieces of their lives and, together, they have built something new and beautiful and strong in the very heart of the wilderness. Their love story is their legacy. A quiet, defiant victory against a brutal world, a testament to the resilience of the human heart and the extraordinary power of a love that was strong enough to overcome all obstacles and find its own justice. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment with where you are listening from to connect with each other. Subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in English.